The moment Farrow saw the woman lying flat on her stomach in the tall prairie grass outside Benton, Montana, he thought she'd been shot. His heart lurched as he spurred his horse forward, dust kicking up from the dry August earth beneath the animal's hooves. It was 1884, and these plains still held dangers that could claim a life in seconds. But as he drew closer, reining his bay gelding to a halt, Mitchell realized the woman wasn't injured at all. She was completely still, yes, but her stillness had purpose. Her hand hovered over something in the grass, and she held a small glass jar in the other. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and spread across her shoulders like spilled wheat. Mitchell dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her, but his boots made noise against the hard-packed earth. The woman's head turned sharply, and he found himself looking into the most remarkable pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. They held annoyance at the interruption, then caution, then something else he couldn't quite name. "You're scaring them away," she said, her voice holding an Eastern accent that marked her as far from home. She gestured at the grass around her. "I've been watching this particular specimen for 20 minutes. Mitchell looked down and saw what had captured her attention. Butterflies. Dozens of them, orange and black, some resting on wildflowers, others dancing through the air in pairs. The woman had been lying in the dirt, her practical gray dress covered in dust and grass stains, watching butterflies. "Madam, I thought you were hurt," Mitchell said, removing his hat. He was a tall man, 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes the color of coffee. His hands were calloused from years of ranch work, but he handled his worn hat with surprising gentleness. "I apologize for disturbing your work." The woman sat up, brushing grass from her sleeves with little success. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with a heart-shaped face and a determined set to her jaw. "I suppose from a distance it might have appeared concerning. I'm Victoria Gaines. I'm studying the migration patterns of Danaus plexippus. Monarch butterflies," she added, seeing his blank expression. "Mitchell Farrow," he replied, still holding his hat. "I run cattle about 5 miles east of here. We don't get many ladies lying in the grass studying butterflies out this way." "I would imagine not," Victoria said, standing and brushing off her skirts with more vigor. She was shorter than he'd expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. "I came from Boston 3 months ago to document the butterfly species of Montana Territory for the Natural History Society. My father arranged for me to stay with the Reverend and Mrs. Harper in Benton while I conduct my research." Mitchell knew the Harpers. Good people, though the Reverend had a tendency to drone on during Sunday services. "That's quite a journey for butterflies." "These butterflies make an even longer journey," Victoria said, warming to her subject. Her eyes lit up as she spoke. "They travel thousands of miles from Canada to Mexico. These particular specimens are preparing for their migration south. I've been documenting their behavior, their numbers, the plants they prefer. Most people see them as just pretty insects, but they're remarkable creatures." She bent down and carefully lifted the glass jar she'd set aside. Inside, delicate wings fluttered against the sides. "I keep them only briefly to sketch and measure them. Then I release them. I'm not interested in killing them for display. I want to understand them while they live." Mitchell found himself fascinated, not by the butterflies, but by the passion in her voice. He'd known plenty of women in his 30 years, but none who spoke with such intensity about something so specific and unusual. Most women in Benton were focused on survival, on keeping house and raising children and enduring the harsh Montana winters. This woman had traveled across the country to lie in the grass and watch insects. "Would you like some help?" The words left his mouth before he'd fully considered them. Victoria looked at him with surprise. Help with my research. I know these lands pretty well, Mitchell said. I could show you places where the wildflowers grow thick, where you might find more of your butterflies. And it's not exactly safe for a lady to be out here alone. We still get the occasional wolf, and there are men who ride through these parts who don't respect much of anything. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her green eyes assessing. I don't need protection, Mr. Farrow. I've been managing quite well on my own. I'm sure you have, Mitchell said, and he meant it. There was steel in this woman's spine, but an extra set of eyes never hurt anyone. And I confess, I find your work interesting. I've never given much thought to butterflies before. Something in Victoria's expression softened. Most people haven't. They're too busy with what they consider important matters to notice the small wonders around them. Mitchell looked at the butterflies drifting through the warm afternoon air, their wings catching the sunlight. Maybe I've been missing out. Victoria smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face. Perhaps you have, Mr. Farrow. Very well. If you're genuinely interested, and not just looking for an excuse to court me in some roundabout cowboy fashion, I would appreciate assistance. I'm planning to ride out to the creek bed tomorrow morning. Mrs. Harper mentioned there are extensive wildflower meadows in that direction. Stony Creek, Mitchell said. I know it well. There's a meadow about 2 miles upstream that should suit your purposes. I'll meet you at the Harper place at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. He replaced his hat and climbed back onto his horse, looking down at Victoria, who watched him with those remarkable eyes. Something had shifted in the air between them, though Mitchell couldn't have named what it was. He only knew that he was already looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. Until tomorrow, then, Mr. Farrow, Victoria said. Mitchell, he said. If we're going to be working together, you might as well call me Mitchell. Then you must call me Victoria. She paused. Or Vicky, as my father calls me, though I've never been terribly fond of it. Victoria suits you better, Mitchell said, and something about the way he said her name made color rise in her cheeks. He rode away, turning once to see her kneeling in the grass again. Her attention already returned to her butterflies. Mitchell found himself grinning like a fool as his horse carried him toward home. He'd ridden out to check on some strays that had wandered from his property, and instead he'd found a woman who documented butterflies with the same dedication most men reserved for hunting gold. That evening, Mitchell found himself unable to concentrate on the work that needed doing. His ranch was modest, 200 acres of decent grazing land and a sturdy house he'd built himself 5 years ago. He ran about 100 head of cattle and did well enough to live comfortably, though not extravagantly. He employed 2 hands, both currently out at the summer pasture camp, which left Mitchell alone with his thoughts and the realization that he was more excited about tomorrow than he'd been about anything since he'd won his first horse at 17. He spent an unusually long time selecting what to wear the next morning, finally settling on his newer shirt, the blue one without any tears or permanent stains. He shined his boots, which was foolish given they'd just get dusty again, and even trimmed his beard more carefully than usual. Looking at himself in the small mirror above his wash basin, Mitchell had to laugh at his own behavior. He was acting like a schoolboy preparing for his first social, not a 30-year-old rancher planning to help a scientist look at butterflies. But when he arrived at the Harper place the next morning and saw Victoria waiting on the porch in a sensible riding outfit, her hair braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a leather satchel that presumably held her research materials, his heart kicked in his chest like an unbroken horse. "Good morning, Mitchell," she said, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. "Morning, Victoria. I brought an extra horse for you if you need one." That's very thoughtful, but Mrs. Harper has kindly lent me her mare. Victoria gestured to a gentle-looking chestnut tied nearby. I've become quite proficient at riding these past months, though I admit it was a skill I had to acquire rather quickly upon arriving here. They rode out together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning coolness. Mitchell led them toward Stony Creek at an easy pace, pointing out landmarks along the way. Victoria proved to be a competent rider, handling the mare with confidence even when they crossed rougher terrain. "Tell me about your ranch," Victoria said as they rode. "What made you choose this life?" Mitchell considered the question. "My father was a rancher in Texas. I grew up around cattle and horses. When I was 25, I decided I wanted land of my own, somewhere that wasn't quite so crowded. Montana Territory seemed like the place to do that. I've been here 5 years now and haven't regretted it once." "You have family back in Texas." "My father passed 6 years ago. My mother remarried and lives in San Antonio with my stepfather. I have a younger sister there too, married with 3 children. Mitchell glanced at Victoria. "What about you? Your father arranged your trip here, you said." "My father is a professor at Harvard," Victoria said. "He studies entomology, the science of insects. I grew up surrounded by books and specimens and passionate discussions about the natural world. When I expressed interest in conducting my own research, he helped me secure funding from the Natural History Society." She paused. "He's one of the few men I've met who believes women are capable of serious scientific work." "You faced resistance then?" "Constantly," Victoria said, and there was steel in her voice again. "Men who dismiss my findings because of my gender. Colleagues of my father's who treat me like an amusing curiosity rather than a legitimate researcher. It's exhausting, always having to prove yourself twice as competent just to be taken half as seriously." Mitchell heard the frustration in her words, the weight of fighting battles that shouldn't need fighting. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is impressive. It takes intelligence and dedication to do what you're doing." Victoria looked at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you, Mitchell. That means more than you might realize." They reached the meadow Mitchell had mentioned, and Victoria's gasp of delight was worth the ride. The area near the creek was carpeted with wildflowers, purple lupines and yellow balsam root and white yarrow, all swaying in the gentle breeze. And everywhere, dancing among the blooms, were butterflies. Not just the monarchs Victoria had been studying, but others too, smaller ones in shades of yellow and blue and white. Victoria dismounted quickly, already pulling equipment from her satchel. She had journals and pencils, small glass jars with holes punched in the lids, measuring tools Mitchell didn't recognize. She moved through the meadow with purpose, stopping to observe, to sketch, to make notes in her neat handwriting. Mitchell tied the horses in the shade and watched her work. There was something beautiful about her complete focus, the way she gave herself over entirely to the task at hand. She photographed the world through careful observation, preserving it not with bullets or brands but with drawings and words. "Mitchell, come look at this one," Victoria called, waving him over. She was crouched beside a purple flower, watching a butterfly with blue wings rest on the petals. "This is a Melissa blue, I think, though I need to examine it more closely to be certain. Would you mind holding this jar?" He knelt beside her, taking the jar she offered. Up close, he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin, could see the golden flecks in her green eyes. His hand brushed hers as she carefully coaxed the butterfly into the jar, and he felt her fingers tremble slightly at the contact. "Got it," she breathed, pulling her hand back. She examined the butterfly through the glass, comparing it to sketches in one of her journals. "Yes, definitely Melissa blue. See the orange band along the edge of the wings. That's characteristic of the species. Mitchell looked at the tiny insect, trying to see what Victoria saw. How do you remember all the differences between them? Practice and passion, Victoria said, still focused on the butterfly. When you care deeply about something, the details become important. Each species has its own patterns, its own preferences, its own story. She looked up at him. Rather like people, I suppose. They spent hours in that meadow, Victoria working and Mitchell helping where he could, learning to see what she saw. She taught him the names of butterflies, how to identify them by wing patterns and behavior. She showed him how the monarchs preferred the milkweed plants, how other species favored different flowers. She explained migration and life cycles, and the delicate balance that allowed these fragile creatures to survive. "You're a natural teacher," Mitchell said as they sat by the creek eating the lunch Victoria had packed. "You make all this interesting." "Or you're a natural student," Victoria replied, biting into an apple. "Most people glaze over when I start talking about wing venation patterns." "I like listening to you talk," Mitchell said honestly. "You care about this work. That comes through in everything you say." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you really here, Mitchell? Yesterday you offered to help, but I assumed you'd lose interest quickly. Most people do." Mitchell set down his sandwich, considering his answer carefully. "I told you the truth. I thought your work was interesting and I wanted to help. But I'll be honest, Victoria, I also wanted to spend time with you. From the moment I saw you lying in that grass, completely absorbed in what you were doing, I wanted to know more about you." "I see," Victoria said quietly. She didn't look away from him, and he couldn't read the expression in her eyes. "I should tell you that I'm not looking for a husband, Mitchell. I've seen too many intelligent women lose themselves in marriage, their own ambitions forgotten in favor of supporting their husband's goals. I have work I want to do, places I want to go. I'm not interested in becoming someone's wife and giving all that up." "I'm not asking you to give anything up," Mitchell said. "I just enjoy your company. Can't that be enough for now?" Victoria smiled, but there was sadness in it. "In my experience, men always want more eventually. They start out claiming they admire your independence, and then slowly they try to reshape you into something more conventional." "I won't do that to you," Mitchell said, and he meant it with everything in him. "You can't know that," Victoria said softly. "Neither of us can know what the future holds." They finished their lunch in companionable silence, and then Victoria returned to her work. Mitchell watched the butterflies, really watched them this time, trying to see them as Victoria did. These tiny creatures traveled impossible distances, survived against tremendous odds, all driven by instincts they didn't understand. There was something profound in that, something that made his own life feel both larger and smaller simultaneously. As the afternoon began to fade, Victoria carefully released all the butterflies she'd captured for study, watching them flutter back into the meadow. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "This has been an incredibly productive day." "Will you come back tomorrow?" Mitchell asked. "There are other places I could show you, other meadows." Victoria looked at him with those assessing green eyes. "I think I'd like that. Yes, let's make it a regular arrangement. You show me good locations for my research, and I'll teach you about butterflies. A fair trade." They rode back to Benton, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled the monarch's wings. Mitchell left Victoria at the Harper place and rode home feeling like something fundamental had shifted in his world. He'd lived 30 years focused on practical matters, on building his ranch and making a living. Now he found himself thinking about butterflies and the woman who studied them, about preservation and beauty, and the courage it took to care deeply about something the world dismissed as unimportant. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Each morning, Mitchell would arrive at the Harper place, and he and Victoria would ride out to some corner of the Montana prairie. She taught him about butterflies and ecology and the interconnectedness of all living things. He taught her about the land, about reading weather patterns and finding water sources and staying safe in wilderness that could be unforgiving. They talked while they rode, sharing stories of their lives. Victoria told him about growing up in Boston, about the privilege and constraints of that world. She described dinner parties where she was expected to look pretty and keep quiet, social events where her scientific interests were treated as an amusing eccentricity rather than serious work. She talked about her mother, who died when Victoria was 15, and how her father had responded to that loss by encouraging Victoria's education, perhaps because he didn't know what else to do with a grieving daughter. Mitchell shared his own stories. He told her about growing up on his father's ranch, about learning to rope and ride almost before he could walk. He described the hard years after his father's death, when he'd realized he needed to forge his own path rather than staying in Texas under his stepfather's shadow. He talked about the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long Montana winters, when days could pass without seeing another human soul. "Don't you ever want more?" Victoria asked one afternoon as they sat beneath a cottonwood tree, watching butterflies dance across a field of yellow flowers. "A wife, children, the kind of life most men your age are building." "I've thought about it," Mitchell admitted. "But I never met anyone who made me want to change my life. The women in Benton are nice enough, but they're looking for something I'm not sure I can give them. They want stability and respectability and a man who'll come home at the same time every evening. I'm not sure I'm that man." "What kind of man are you?" Victoria asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. Mitchell considered the question. "The kind who likes wide, open spaces and work that changes with the seasons. The kind who'd rather spend a day helping a woman catalog butterflies than sitting in a saloon playing cards. The kind who thinks maybe the unconventional life might be the right life if you're living it with the right person." Victoria looked away, but not before he saw something flicker in her expression. "Mitchell, we should be careful. We're becoming friends, and I value that, but I'll be leaving Montana when my research is complete. I can't let myself develop feelings that would complicate that." "When will that be?" Mitchell asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The funding from the Natural History Society runs through October. I need to return to Boston before winter sets in here. That gives me another 2 months. 2 months. 8 weeks. Mitchell felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Then we have 2 months to make the most of. No expectations beyond that." But even as he said the words, Mitchell knew he was lying to himself. His feelings for Victoria went deeper than friendship, deeper than simple attraction. He looked forward to their mornings together with an intensity that bordered on desperate. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what she was observing, what insights she was recording in her neat handwriting. When she laughed at something he said, the sound settled in his chest like homecoming. The problem was, Mitchell was fairly certain Victoria felt something too, despite her protestations. He caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. Her hand would linger on his arm when he helped her across the creek. She'd begun sharing things with him that seemed more personal than scientific, private thoughts and fears she probably didn't voice to many people. One particularly warm afternoon in early September, they rode out to a canyon about 10 miles from Benton. Mitchell had mentioned that wildflowers grew thick in the sheltered areas there, and Victoria had been eager to explore new terrain. They picked their way down a narrow trail, the horses sure-footed on the rocky path. The canyon was everything Mitchell had promised. Sheltered from the worst winds with a small spring providing water, the area supported a surprising variety of plant life. Victoria immediately set to work, but Mitchell noticed she seemed distracted, not as focused as usual. "Is everything all right?" he asked after watching her start and stop several tasks without completing any of them. Victoria sat down on a flat rock, removing her hat and wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "I received a letter from my father yesterday. He wants me to come home early. There's a position opening up at a museum in New York, cataloging their insect collection. He thinks I should apply for it." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Mitchell said carefully, sitting beside her. "It is," Victoria agreed. "It would be steady work, respected work. I could continue my research in a more structured environment. It's exactly the kind of position I've been working toward." "But," Mitchell prompted, hearing the uncertainty in her voice. "But it would mean leaving in 3 weeks instead of 2 months. And it would mean accepting that my days of field research are over, at least for the foreseeable future. I'd be working with dead specimens, butterflies pinned to boards instead of living creatures in their natural habitat." She looked at him, and her eyes were troubled. "I'd be giving up work like this, days like this." Mitchell's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," Victoria said, and there was anguish in her voice. "The practical choice is obvious. The museum position offers security and recognition in my field. But these past weeks, riding out here with you, seeing these butterflies in the wild, it's been the happiest I've been in years. I feel more myself here than I ever did in Boston." "Then stay," Mitchell said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Finish your research. Don't cut it short for a position that will make you unhappy." "It wouldn't make me unhappy," Victoria said, but she didn't sound convinced. "It would be different, that's all. More civilized, more appropriate for a woman of my background." Mitchell turned to face her fully. "Victoria, I've watched you work for weeks now. I've seen how alive you are out here, how passionate you are about this research. Can you honestly tell me you'd be equally satisfied working in a museum, organizing dead insects according to someone else's system?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "No," she finally said. "I don't think I would be, but I also can't spend my whole life wandering from place to place doing field research. Eventually, I'll need something more permanent, more stable." "Why?" Mitchell asked. "Who says you need that?" "Society says so. My father's colleagues say so. The voice in my head that sounds suspiciously like my mother says so." Victoria stood, pacing away from him. "You don't understand what it's like, Mitchell. As a woman in my field, I'm constantly fighting to be taken seriously. If I turn down a respectable position to keep chasing butterflies across the Western Territories, people will say I'm not serious about my work. They'll say I'm just playing at being a scientist." "Let them say what they want," Mitchell said, standing too. "You know the truth of your work. Anyone who reads your research will know it too." Victoria turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "It's not that simple. I have to think about my future, about supporting myself. Women don't have the same freedoms you do, Mitchell. I can't just decide to homestead somewhere and build a life from nothing. I need patronage, funding, connections. The museum position provides all of that." Mitchell wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she could stay here, could continue her work with him by her side. But he heard the fear beneath her words, understood the impossible position she was in. For all her independence and courage, Victoria lived in a world that constrained her choices at every turn. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right. I don't fully understand your situation. But I do know this. You're one of the bravest, most intelligent people I've ever met. Whatever you decide, I'm certain it will be the right choice for you. Victoria wiped at her eyes, trying to smile. Thank you for saying that, and I'm sorry for breaking down like this. It's just that this decision feels heavier than it should. 3 weeks ago, I would have jumped at the museum position without hesitation. Now, Mitchell prompted softly. Now there are things here I'd be leaving behind, Victoria said, looking directly at him. Things I didn't expect to find. The air between them felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm. Mitchell took a step toward her, then another. Victoria, I know you said you weren't looking for this, and I promise not to ask for more than you could give. But I need you to know that these weeks with you have meant everything to me. You've changed how I see the world, how I see possibility. I'm not asking you to give up your work or your ambitions. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe there's a way to have both. Your research and whatever this is between us. Victoria's breath caught. Mitchell, I can't. Even if I wanted to, and I'm not saying I do, it wouldn't work. My life is in the East. My work takes me all over. You have your ranch, your life here. How could we possibly make that work? I don't know, Mitchell admitted. But I think we could figure it out if we wanted to. I have good hands who could run the ranch when I'm not here. I could travel with you, help you with your research. Or you could base yourself here and do your field work in the territories during the warm months. There are possibilities, Victoria, if you're willing to consider them. You'd give up your ranch, your whole life here, Victoria asked, and she sounded almost scared. I'd adapt my life, Mitchell corrected. I'm not suggesting either of us sacrifice everything. I'm suggesting we build something new together, something that honors what we both need. Victoria closed her eyes. This is happening too fast. A month ago, I didn't even know you existed. I can't make life-altering decisions based on feelings that developed so quickly. Why not? Mitchell asked. Sometimes the quickest decisions are the ones your heart's been waiting to make. That's romantic nonsense, Victoria said, but her voice wavered. Is it? Mitchell took another step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough to smell lavender and sunshine and prairie grass. Victoria, I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I've already fallen. I know it's fast and I know it complicates everything, but it's the truth. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you feel something too. Victoria looked up at him, and her eyes were swimming with tears again. Of course I feel something. I feel terrified. I've spent my whole life building toward independence, toward being taken seriously as a scientist. And now you're asking me to risk all of that for feelings I don't entirely understand. I'm not asking you to risk anything, Mitchell said gently. I'm asking you to believe that you can have both, your work and a relationship, your independence and someone who loves you. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. In my experience, they always are, Victoria whispered. Mitchell raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. She leaned into his touch despite herself. Then let's write a different story. One where the brilliant scientist gets to keep doing her work and also gets to be loved exactly as she is. Mitchell, Victoria breathed, and then she was kissing him, or he was kissing her, and it didn't matter who had closed the final distance between them. The kiss was soft and desperate all at once, tasting of salt from her tears and something sweeter beneath. Mitchell's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Victoria's hands fisted in his shirt as if she was afraid of falling. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victoria pressed her forehead against his chest. This doesn't solve anything, she said, but she didn't let go of him. Maybe not, Mitchell agreed, his chin resting on top of her head, but it's a start. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the canyon while butterflies danced around them, oblivious to human complications. Finally, Victoria pulled back enough to look up at him. I need time to think, she said. About the museum position, about what I want, about all of this. Can you give me that? Of course, Mitchell said, though the thought of waiting, of not knowing, made his chest ache. Take all the time you need. They rode back to Benton in near silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet they'd shared before. Everything felt fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. When Mitchell left Victoria at the Harper place, she caught his hand before he could ride away. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. Mitchell's heart lifted. Same time tomorrow. But the next morning, Victoria wasn't waiting on the porch as usual. Mrs. Harper came out instead, a sympathetic look on her kind face. "She's not feeling well, Mr. Farrow. Asked me to send her apologies." Mitchell knew evasion when he heard it. Victoria wasn't sick. She was hiding, probably trying to sort through the tangle of feelings between them. He nodded to Mrs. Harper and rode away, but instead of going home, he found himself riding to the canyon where they'd kissed the day before. He spent the day there, watching the butterflies Victoria loved so much. He tried to see them as she did, to understand what drove her passion. These creatures lived such brief lives, burning bright and then fading. They didn't waste time worrying about the future or agonizing over decisions. They simply followed their nature, migrating south when the time came, never doubting the instincts that guided them. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon in gold and amber light, Mitchell found himself thinking about preservation. Victoria had mentioned once that some collectors killed butterflies and pinned them to boards, preserving their beauty but destroying their essence. She preferred to document them alive, to watch them fly free. She wanted to preserve the moment without destroying it. That's what Mitchell wanted too. He wanted to preserve this time with Victoria, these perfect days of discovery and connection, without pinning either of them down into something rigid and lifeless. But how did you hold on to something while still letting it fly free? The answer came to him as he watched a monarch butterfly land on a purple flower, its wings opening and closing slowly in the fading light. You didn't capture it. You created the right conditions for it to want to stay. Mitchell rode home with a plan forming in his mind. He couldn't make Victoria choose him over her work, but maybe he could show her that choosing him didn't mean giving up anything else. The next 3 days passed without word from Victoria. Mitchell respected her need for space, though it cost him. He threw himself into ranch work, fixing fence and moving cattle and keeping his hands busy while his mind raced. His 2 ranch hands had returned from the summer pasture, and they gave him odd looks when they caught him staring off into space, but Mitchell didn't care what they thought. On the 4th day, a note arrived. Victoria's handwriting on the outside, his name spelled in neat letters. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Mitchell, I'm sorry for avoiding you. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Would you meet me at the meadow by Stony Creek tomorrow afternoon? There's something I need to show you. Victoria." Mitchell read the note 3 times, trying to extract some hint of what she'd decided from the careful words. But there was nothing, just a simple request. He sent a reply confirming he'd be there, then spent a restless night imagining every possible outcome. He arrived at the meadow early, unable to wait at home any longer. The September afternoon was warm, the last gasp of summer before autumn truly took hold. The wildflowers were beginning to fade, their blooms smaller and less vibrant than they'd been in August. Mitchell tied his horse and walked to the creek bank, watching the water flow past, steady and unchanging. He heard Victoria's horse before he saw her. She rode into the meadow with her usual competence, dismounting and tying her mare before walking over to where Mitchell waited. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd slept about as well as he had. "Thank you for coming," she said formally, as if they hadn't kissed 4 days ago, as if everything between them hadn't changed. Of course, Mitchell replied, matching her tone. You said you had something to show me, Victoria nodded, pulling her leather satchel over her shoulder. Walk with me. They walked along the creek bank, neither speaking until they reached a particular spot where a fallen cottonwood created a natural bridge across the water. Victoria set down her satchel and pulled out one of her journals, flipping to a marked page. I've been documenting my time here, she said, showing him the page. It was covered in sketches of butterflies, notes about species and behaviors. But in the margins were other notes, personal observations about the landscape, about Montana, about learning to see the world differently. She turned to another page, and Mitchell saw his own name written there. Notes about conversations they'd had, things he'd shown her. A small sketch of him sitting on a rock, watching butterflies. I've been preserving these moments, Victoria said quietly. Not just the scientific data, but the experience of being here, of being with you. She looked up at him, and her eyes were full of emotion. I wrote to my father. I turned down the museum position. Mitchell's heart leaped, but he forced himself to stay calm. Why? Because you were right. Taking that position would have made me miserable. I would have been safe and respectable and slowly dying inside. Victoria took a shaky breath. But I also can't stay in Montana indefinitely. My funding runs out in October, and I need to complete my research properly. So what will you do? Mitchell asked, not sure if he wanted to hear the answer. I'm going to finish my work here. I'm going to compile my findings and submit them to the Natural History Society. And then I'm going to apply for funding to continue field research in other territories. Colorado, maybe, or New Mexico. She looked at him steadily. And I'd like you to come with me if you want to. You said you could get help to run your ranch. I'd like to find out if you meant that. Mitchell felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. You want me to travel with you, to help with your research? I want more than that, Victoria said, and now her voice was shaking. I want what you offered in the canyon, a partnership where I don't have to give up my work, but I also don't have to be alone. I'm terrified, Mitchell. I'm terrified that I'm making a huge mistake, that this will end badly, that I'll lose myself or my work or both. But I'm more terrified of walking away from you and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Mitchell closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. You're not making a mistake. I promise you, Victoria, you're not making a mistake. She clung to him, her face buried against his shoulder. How can you be so sure? Because I know you, Mitchell said firmly. You're not the kind of person who makes reckless decisions. If you're choosing this, choosing us, it's because it's right. Trust yourself. Victoria pulled back to look at him, and there were tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. I do choose this. I choose you. I'm still terrified, but I choose you. Mitchell kissed her then, properly this time, without the desperate urgency of their first kiss in the canyon. This kiss was a promise, a beginning, a leap of faith they were taking together. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. So we're really doing this? Victoria asked. You'll help me with my research, travel with me to other territories. On one condition, Mitchell said. Marry me first. I want to travel with you as your husband, not just your assistant. Victoria's eyes widened. Mitchell, that's a rather significant condition. I know. But I love you, Victoria Gaines. I want to spend my life helping you chase butterflies across the West. I want to be your partner in every sense of the word. So marry me. We'll finish your work here, get married in October before your funding runs out, and then we'll figure out the rest together. Victoria laughed, a sound of pure joy. You're completely mad. We've known each other barely a month. Does that matter? Mitchell asked. Do you need more time to know if this is right? Victoria studied his face for a long moment, and Mitchell saw the exact instant she made her decision. "No," she said. "I don't need more time. Yes, Mitchell Farrow, I'll marry you. I'll marry you and drag you all over the territories looking at butterflies, and we'll probably drive each other crazy. But yes, absolutely yes." Mitchell swept her up, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he was scaring the butterflies. When he set her down, she was flushed and breathless and beautiful, and Mitchell thought his heart might burst from happiness. They spent the rest of the afternoon in that meadow, making plans and dreaming about the future. Victoria showed him more of her research, and Mitchell suggested locations in other territories where he thought her butterflies might migrate. They talked about logistics, about how to balance ranch management with travel, about where they might settle eventually when the time came to stop moving. "I'll need to write my father," Victoria said as the sun began to set. "He's going to be shocked." "Will he approve?" Mitchell asked. "I think so," Victoria said thoughtfully. "He's always wanted me to be happy, and he knows how much field research means to me. Besides, you're helping me with my work. That's more than most husbands would do." "Most husbands are fools," Mitchell said, pulling her close. "They don't realize what an honor it is to support someone they love in doing what they're meant to do." Victoria kissed him softly. "I'm very lucky I found you, or rather that you found me lying in the grass stalking butterflies." "Best day of my life," Mitchell said honestly. They rode back to Benton as darkness fell, already planning their next expedition. When Mitchell left Victoria at the Harper place, the Reverend and his wife were waiting on the porch with knowing smiles. "I take it congratulations are in order?" Mrs. Harper asked. Victoria blushed. "How did you know, my dear? Anyone with eyes could see how you two look at each other, Mrs. Harper said kindly. "We're very happy for you both." The Reverend shook Mitchell's hand. "I'll be honored to perform the ceremony. October, you said." Word spread quickly through Benton. The Eastern lady scientist was marrying the quiet rancher, and they planned to travel the territories together studying butterflies. Some people thought it romantic. Others thought it foolish. Mitchell didn't care what anyone thought. He was too busy helping Victoria finish her research and preparing for the biggest adventure of his life. The weeks before the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Victoria worked tirelessly to compile her findings into a comprehensive report for the Natural History Society. Mitchell made arrangements with his ranch hands to manage things during his absence, promoted his most trusted man to foreman with a share of the profits. He sold off some cattle to free up capital for travel expenses, and bought a sturdy wagon that could serve as mobile living quarters and workspace for Victoria. Victoria's father sent a telegram expressing surprise, but also support, along with a generous wedding gift that would help fund their first expedition to Colorado. He couldn't make the journey to Montana for the wedding, but promised to visit them wherever they settled eventually. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the Benton church, with most of the town in attendance. Victoria wore a simple dress in deep green that matched her eyes, with late blooming wildflowers in her hair. Mitchell wore his best suit, the one he'd bought in Denver 3 years ago and had barely worn since. As they stood before Reverend Harper and exchanged vows, Mitchell looked at his bride and felt overwhelming gratitude for the day he'd ridden out to check on strays and found her lying in the grass instead. She'd been preserving a moment, documenting something beautiful and fleeting. And in doing so, she'd created a moment he wanted to preserve forever, the moment everything in his life had changed. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Harper said, beaming. "You may kiss your bride." Mitchell did thoroughly, while the congregation cheered and Mrs. Harper wiped happy tears from her eyes. The reception was held at the town hall, with food contributed by half the women in Benton, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Victoria surprised everyone, including Mitchell, by being an excellent dancer, spinning and laughing in his arms like she'd been born to it. My mother insisted I learn, she explained breathlessly between dances. She said a lady should be accomplished in all the social graces, even if I preferred to spend my time with insects. Remind me to thank your mother's memory, Mitchell said, pulling her close for a slower dance. This is perfect. You're perfect. I'm really not, Victoria said, but she was smiling. I'm stubborn and single-minded, and I'll probably drive you to distraction with my work. I'm counting on it, Mitchell murmured, kissing her temple. They spent their wedding night in Mitchell's ranch house, which Victoria had visited only a few times during their courtship. Mitchell had cleaned and prepared it for her arrival, bringing in extra lamps and building additional shelves for her books and research materials. It's not much, he said, suddenly nervous as he carried her across the threshold. But it's solid and warm, and we can make improvements before winter sets in. Victoria looked around the main room with its stone fireplace and simple furniture, and her eyes filled with tears. It's wonderful. It's home. They made love that night with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies the way they'd learned each other's minds over the past months. Afterward, lying in Mitchell's arms with moonlight streaming through the window, Victoria traced patterns on his chest. I'm happy, she said, as if the realization surprised her. Completely, utterly happy. I didn't think that was possible. Why not? Mitchell asked, running his fingers through her loose hair. Because happiness always seemed contingent on giving something up. My independence or my work or my dreams. But with you, I don't have to give up anything. I get to keep all of it and have you too. That's how it should be, Mitchell said. Love shouldn't require sacrifice. It should make everything better, fuller, more possible. Victoria lifted her head to kiss him. How did you get so wise? Spent a lot of time alone with cattle, Mitchell deadpanned. They're very philosophical animals. Victoria laughed, the sound filling the room with joy, and Mitchell thought that he could happily spend the rest of his life making her laugh like that. They spent 2 more weeks at the ranch, preparing for their departure to Colorado. Victoria taught Mitchell more about proper documentation and scientific observation. Mitchell taught Victoria about camping in rough country and staying safe on the trail. They were building a partnership, learning to work together as smoothly as they'd learned to be together. On the morning they left for Colorado, half of Benton turned out to see them off. The wagon was loaded with supplies, research equipment, and Victoria's carefully preserved journals documenting her Montana findings. Mitchell had bought 2 good riding horses and arranged for his ranch foreman to forward any important correspondence to them at predetermined stops along their route. You'll write, Mrs. Harper asked Victoria, embracing her fondly. Let us know where you are, I promise, Victoria said. And we'll return next summer if possible. I'd like to do a comparative study of the monarch population across multiple seasons. Reverend Harper shook Mitchell's hand. Take care of each other out there. We will, Mitchell promised. As they rode out of Benton, Victoria turned to take one last look at the town that had been her home for 6 months. Mitchell saw tears in her eyes. Having second thoughts, he asked gently. No, Victoria said firmly, wiping her eyes. Just grateful thoughts. I came here alone, looking for butterflies. I'm leaving with so much more. The journey to Colorado took 3 weeks. They traveled slowly, stopping whenever Victoria spotted promising locations for observation. She documented species along the route, filling new journals with sketches and notes. Mitchell proved invaluable, helping set up camps and keeping watch while Victoria lost herself in her work. They camped under stars that seemed close enough to touch, made love in the wagon while rain drummed on the canvas roof, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Mitchell told stories of his childhood in Texas, and Victoria shared memories of her mother, things she'd never told anyone else. "She would have liked you," Victoria said one night as they sat by their campfire in the foothills of the Rockies. "She was always secretly proud of my scientific interests, even though she had to pretend to disapprove in public. She would have loved that I found someone who supports my work." "I wish I could have met her," Mitchell said. "Me too," Victoria said softly. They reached Boulder, Colorado in early November, just as the first snows were beginning to dust the high peaks. Victoria had arranged through correspondence to stay at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who was used to hosting visiting scholars and asked no questions about Victoria's unconventional research. Colorado proved to be everything Victoria had hoped for. Even as winter approached, she found evidence of butterfly populations that differed from what she'd observed in Montana. She worked tirelessly, bundled in layers against the cold, documenting and theorizing and filling journal after journal with her findings. Mitchell helped however he could, and in between supporting Victoria's work, he found odd jobs around Boulder to supplement their funds. He worked for a rancher who needed help with his winter herd, fixed fences, even helped build a barn. The work was familiar and grounding, a reminder of his old life even as he embraced this new one. On Christmas Eve, they sat in their small rented room above Mrs. Chen's kitchen, exchanging gifts. Victoria gave Mitchell a journal she'd made herself, with his name embossed on the leather cover. "For your own observations," she said. "You've learned so much about butterflies and field research. I thought you might want to document your own thoughts." Mitchell was touched beyond words. He gave her a wooden case he'd commissioned from a local craftsman, designed specifically to hold and protect her research journals. "So you can keep all your work safe," he explained. "Everything you're preserving, all these moments and observations, they're important. They deserve to be protected." Victoria kissed him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for understanding what this work means to me, for never asking me to be less than I am." "I'd never do that," Mitchell said, pulling her close. "You're extraordinary exactly as you are." They spent the winter in Colorado, and as spring approached, they began planning their next destination. New Mexico Territory, Victoria decided. The climate there would support butterfly species they hadn't encountered yet, and the terrain offered diverse ecosystems to study. But before they could leave, Victoria began feeling ill in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to something she'd eaten, but when the nausea persisted for 2 weeks, Mrs. Chen pulled her aside with a knowing smile. "Mrs. Farrow, I think you might want to see the doctor," she said kindly. "I've had 6 children myself, and I recognize the signs." Victoria stared at her in shock. Pregnant. She might be pregnant. She'd been so focused on her work, on their travels, that she hadn't even considered the possibility. The doctor confirmed it. She was about 3 months along, which meant the baby would arrive in late summer. Victoria walked back to the boarding house in a daze, not sure how she felt. Happy, certainly. Terrified, absolutely. But also concerned about what this meant for her work, for their travels. Mitchell was repairing a broken chair leg in their room when she entered. He took one look at her face and set down his tools. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediate concern in his voice. "I'm pregnant," Victoria said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "We're going to have a baby." Mitchell's expression transformed from concern to wonder to absolute joy in the space of seconds. He crossed to her in 3 strides, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "A baby," he breathed. "Victoria, that's wonderful, isn't it? Are you happy?" "I think so," Victoria said honestly. "I'm also scared. What about my research? What about our travels? Babies require stability, don't they? We can't just wander the territories with an infant. Mitchell guided her to sit on their bed, taking her hands in his. We'll figure it out. Maybe we do New Mexico this spring and summer, finish your research there before the baby comes. Then we could return to Montana for the birth, spend the winter at the ranch. Give ourselves time to adjust before deciding what comes next. You'd be willing to do that? Victoria asked. Give up traveling for a while, Victoria. I'd give up anything for you and our child, Mitchell said seriously. But I don't think this has to be an end to your work. It might slow things down for a bit, but we'll find a way to make it work. Maybe we can't travel as constantly with a baby, but that doesn't mean you have to stop researching. We'll adapt. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears. I was so afraid you'd expect me to give everything up, to become a conventional wife and mother. I married a butterfly scientist who drags me across the territories in pursuit of insects, Mitchell said, wiping her tears with his thumbs. I knew what I was getting into. A baby doesn't change who you are, Victoria. It just adds to our family, to our adventure. Victoria kissed him hard, pouring all her love and gratitude and relief into it. When they broke apart, she was smiling through her tears. We're going to be parents, she said, wonder creeping into her voice. We're going to have a little person who's half me and half you. God help them, Mitchell joked, and Victoria laughed, the sound bubbling up from deep in her chest. They traveled to New Mexico territory in April, moving carefully now that Victoria was visibly pregnant. They spent 3 months there, and Victoria managed to accomplish significant research, despite her growing belly and increasing fatigue. Mitchell was endlessly patient, helping her navigate rough terrain and setting up comfortable camps where she could rest when needed. In July, as the summer heat became oppressive and Victoria's energy waned, they made the journey back to Montana. The ranch looked exactly as they'd left it, well maintained by Mitchell's foreman and hands. The house needed some work to prepare for a baby, and Mitchell threw himself into the task with enthusiasm, building a cradle and baby-proofing the space while Victoria organized her research from the past year. On a warm August evening, Victoria went into labor. Mrs. Harper came to help, along with the town doctor, and after 12 hours of hard work, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Marcus Henry Farrow, after both their fathers. Mitchell held his son for the first time with shaking hands, awed by the tiny, perfect person they'd created. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "Victoria, he's perfect." Victoria, exhausted but radiant, smiled from the bed. "He has your eyes." "And your determination, probably," Mitchell said, gently rocking the baby. "Look how tightly he's gripping my finger. He's already ready to take on the world." The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Marcus was a fussy baby who seemed to sleep in unpredictable fits and starts, leaving both Mitchell and Victoria perpetually tired. But watching their son grow and change, seeing his personality begin to emerge, filled them with a joy neither had anticipated. Victoria found herself struggling with the isolation of new motherhood. She loved Marcus desperately, but she also missed her work, missed the freedom to spend hours observing butterflies without interruption. She felt guilty for missing it, felt like wanting anything beyond her baby made her a bad mother. Mitchell found her crying one afternoon when Marcus was 3 months old, standing at the window and staring out at the prairie where she'd spent so many happy days researching. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I miss my work," Victoria admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I love Marcus more than anything, but I miss being out there, documenting and discovering." "Does that make me terrible?" "It makes you human," Mitchell said firmly. "And it makes you the woman I fell in love with." Victoria, you don't have to choose between being a mother and being a scientist. Marcus is old enough now that we can take him with us on shorter trips, and when we need to go farther, I'm sure Mrs. Harper would be willing to help watch him for a few days. Really? Victoria asked, hope flaring in her chest. You wouldn't think less of me for leaving our baby to go study butterflies. I think you're an excellent mother who also happens to be a brilliant scientist, Mitchell said. Those things don't cancel each other out. They make you who you are, and Marcus will grow up knowing his mother is someone special, someone who contributes to the world's understanding of the natural world. So they began experimenting with a new balance. Short day trips at first, with Marcus bundled up and carried in a sling against Victoria's chest while she observed and documented. As winter approached, they made plans for the following spring. Mrs. Harper agreed enthusiastically to watch Marcus for a 2-week expedition Victoria wanted to make to Wyoming Territory. That boy will be spoiled rotten by the time you return, Mrs. Harper said cheerfully. The Reverend and I never had children of our own. We'd be delighted to dote on Marcus for a few weeks. The winter was long and cold, but Victoria used the time productively, working on compiling her research from Montana, Colorado, and New Mexico into a comprehensive manuscript. She wrote by lamplight while Marcus napped, documenting patterns she'd observed across the territories, theorizing about migration routes and climate impacts on butterfly populations. In March, she sent the completed manuscript to the Natural History Society in Boston. And in April, she and Mitchell left Marcus with the Harpers and embarked on their Wyoming expedition. It felt strange to be traveling just the two of them again, after months of organizing everything around Marcus's needs. But it also felt wonderful, like reclaiming a part of themselves they'd worried might be lost. They rode through landscapes still touched by winter's cold, documenting early-season butterflies and making plans for future research. On the last night before they were to return to Benton, they camped beside a crystal-clear lake in the foothills of the Wind River Range. The stars reflected on the water's surface, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. "Are you happy?" Mitchell asked, the same question he'd asked in different ways throughout their relationship. "Completely," Victoria said, and she meant it. "I have my work, I have you, I have Marcus, I have a life I never imagined possible." "You've accomplished so much," Mitchell said. "Your research is going to change how people understand butterflies, understand migration. You should be proud." "I am," Victoria said, "but I'm most proud of what we've built together. This partnership where neither of us has to diminish ourselves to make room for the other." Mitchell pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. 2 years ago, Mitchell had been a solitary rancher thinking his life was set. Victoria had been a scientist fighting for recognition in a world that dismissed women's contributions. Now they were partners, parents, and pioneers in their own way, forging a path that honored both their needs. They returned to Benton to find Marcus had indeed been thoroughly spoiled by the Harpers, but also that a letter had arrived from the Natural History Society. Victoria's hands shook as she opened it, Mitchell looking over her shoulder while Mrs. Harper held a fussy Marcus. The society was publishing her research. More than that, they were so impressed with her findings that they wanted to commission additional work, with funding for a 3-year study of butterfly populations across the Western Territories. The pay was generous, enough to support their small family comfortably, while still allowing Mitchell to maintain his ranch as a home base. Victoria read the letter 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. This was recognition, real recognition of her work. She wasn't just a woman playing at science. She was a respected researcher being asked to conduct important work. Mitchell, she breathed. They want to publish my work. They want to fund more research. Mitchell swept her into his arms, careful not to crush the letter between them. I'm so proud of you. I knew your work was important. Now the world will know it too. That night, after Marcus was asleep in his cradle, Victoria and Mitchell sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold. Victoria leaned against Mitchell's shoulder, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Mitchell asked. "For seeing me. All of me. For never asking me to be smaller or quieter or more conventional. For building this life with me where I get to be exactly who I am." Mitchell kissed the top of her head. "That's the easiest thing I've ever done, loving you exactly as you are." They spent the next 3 years traveling the territories during the warm months, with Marcus learning to walk in meadows full of butterflies and speak his first words while watching his mother work. Victoria's research earned her increasing recognition in scientific circles. Her detailed documentation of butterfly migration patterns became required reading for naturalists studying insect behavior. When Marcus was 4 years old, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought only joy, no fear about what it might mean for her work. They had proven they could balance parenthood and research. A second child would be an adjustment, certainly, but not an insurmountable obstacle. Their daughter, Lily Rose Farrow, was born on a spring morning in 1889. Arriving with considerably less fuss than her brother had. She was a calm baby where Marcus had been fussy, sleeping peacefully through the night from only a few weeks old. "This one takes after you," Victoria told Mitchell, watching him rock their daughter while Marcus helped by patting her tiny hand. "Peaceful and steady." "While Marcus takes after you," Mitchell observed as their son immediately started asking questions about when the baby would be old enough to go look at butterflies with him. Curious and intense. They were a family now, in the fullest sense of the word. The ranch in Benton was their home base, the place they returned to between expeditions. Mitchell's cattle operation continued to provide steady income, managed ably by his foreman, while Victoria's research grants funded their travels and her work. Marcus grew into a thoughtful boy who inherited his mother's love of nature and his father's steady temperament. He learned to identify butterfly species before he could read, could track migration patterns across a map by the time he was 6. Lily was quieter, more observant, but no less fascinated by the natural world their mother studied. By the time Marcus was 10 and Lily was 6, they were seasoned travelers, comfortable camping under the stars and helping with research documentation. Marcus had his own journal where he recorded observations, and Lily had developed a talent for sketching butterflies that rivaled her mother's. Victoria published her 3rd major research paper that year, a comprehensive study of butterfly populations across the Western Territories that established her as one of the leading experts in her field. The Natural History Society invited her to present her findings at their annual conference in Boston. "You should go," Mitchell said when she received the invitation. "This is a huge honor." "I can't leave you alone with both children for that long," Victoria protested. "It would be at least 6 weeks of travel, maybe more." "So we'll all go," Mitchell said simply. "We can visit your father in Boston. The children can see where you grew up. We'll make it an adventure." So in the autumn of 1893, the Farrow family traveled east. Victoria presented her research to a room full of distinguished scientists, many of whom were shocked to discover the V. Gaines, whose papers they'd been reading, was a woman. Mitchell sat in the audience with Marcus and Lily, watching his wife command the room with her knowledge and passion, and felt his heart swell with pride. After the presentation, As Victoria fielded questions and accepted congratulations, Mitchell overheard two older scientists talking near the back of the room. "Remarkable work," one said. "Though I must say, I'm surprised she's managed to accomplish so much with a family. Most women find they must choose between scientific work and domestic life." "Perhaps," the other scientist replied. "She simply found the right partner, someone secure enough to support her ambitions rather than suppress them." Mitchell smiled to himself. That was exactly what he'd tried to be for Victoria. Not a constraint on her brilliance, but a foundation that allowed her to soar. They spent 2 weeks in Boston, visiting Victoria's father, who was delighted to finally meet his grandchildren. Professor Gaines was older now, his hair completely white, but his enthusiasm for natural sciences hadn't dimmed. He spent hours with Marcus and Lily, showing them specimens from his collection and telling them stories about their mother's childhood. "She was always different," he told the children one afternoon while Victoria and Mitchell went for a walk together through the city. "Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. I knew she'd do important work someday." On their last evening in Boston, Victoria's father hosted a dinner party, inviting colleagues and former professors who'd known Victoria when she was younger. Several of them admitted they doubted her commitment to serious research when she'd first announced her plans to study butterflies in the Western Territories. "We thought it was a passing fancy," one professor admitted. "We were wrong. Your work has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of Lepidoptera migration. You've proven that field research can be just as rigorous as laboratory work." Victoria accepted the praise graciously. But later, alone with Mitchell in their hotel room, she expressed her frustration. "They act like they're surprised I succeeded, as if being a woman made it inevitable that I'd fail or give up. But you didn't fail," Mitchell pointed out. "You succeeded spectacularly despite all the obstacles they put in your way. That's worth celebrating." "I suppose," Victoria said. "I just wish I hadn't had to fight so hard to be taken seriously." "Maybe your daughter won't have to fight as hard," Mitchell said. "You're paving the way, showing what's possible. That matters, Victoria. It matters more than you might realize." They returned to Montana in November, just as the first snows were beginning to fall. The ranch felt like coming home after their time in the busy East. The children ran through the house, delighting in familiar spaces, while Mitchell and Victoria stood on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. "You ever regret it?" Victoria asked quietly. "Giving up the simpler life you had before you met me?" "You could have married someone conventional, had a quiet life raising cattle and children." Mitchell turned to look at her, this woman who transformed his entire world. "Never. Not for 1 second. This life, this chaotic, unconventional, wonderful life we've built together, is exactly what I needed. I just didn't know it until I found you lying in the grass, cataloging butterflies." Victoria smiled, the same smile that had captivated him 9 years ago. "I wanted to preserve that moment forever. Document it, understand it, hold on to it somehow." "And did you?" Mitchell asked. "Better than I imagined," Victoria said. "I didn't just preserve the moment. I built a whole life around it, a life full of moments worth preserving." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new adventures and discoveries. Marcus grew into a serious young man who decided to study biology at university, planning to follow in his mother's footsteps as a naturalist. Lily developed her artistic talents, creating detailed illustrations for Victoria's research papers that were works of art in their own right. Mitchell continued ranching, though on a smaller scale now, content to let his foreman handle the day-to-day operations while he traveled with Victoria and helped with her research. He'd become quite knowledgeable about butterflies himself over the years, even co-authoring a paper with Victoria about seasonal variations in monarch populations. In 1902, when Victoria was 44 years old and Mitchell 48, the Natural History Society published her comprehensive volume on Western butterflies, a massive work that synthesized nearly 2 decades of research. The book was dedicated to Mitchell, who taught me that love expands possibilities rather than limiting them, and to Marcus and Lily, who prove that women can have both meaningful work and meaningful family. The book's success was immediate. It became the definitive reference on Western butterfly species, used by naturalists and scientists across the country. Universities invited Victoria to lecture, scientific societies awarded her honors, and her father wrote to say he'd never been more proud. But Victoria's proudest moment came on a warm spring day when Lily, now 20 years old and newly graduated from art school, announced she wanted to join her mother on her next research expedition, to document butterfly species through illustrations. "I've decided what I want to do with my life," Lily said over dinner at the ranch. "I want to create a comprehensive illustrated guide to North American butterflies, scientific illustrations that are also beautiful art, and I want to work with you, Mama, to make sure the science is accurate." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Nothing would make me happier than working with you, sweetheart." Marcus, home from university for the summer, raised his glass. "To the next generation of butterfly scientists, may they be as dedicated and stubborn as their mother." Mitchell laughed, raising his own glass. "And as brilliant." They clinked glasses together, this family bound by love and butterflies and the willingness to forge their own path regardless of what convention dictated. That summer, Mitchell turned 50. Victoria organized a surprise party at the ranch, inviting friends from Benton and colleagues from various scientific societies Victoria had worked with over the years. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Mitchell found himself surrounded by the life he'd built, and he was overwhelmed with gratitude. Victoria found him standing alone near the barn, watching the party but not part of it. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "About a day 18 years ago," Mitchell said, "when I rode out to check on some strays and found you lying in the grass instead. I thought you'd been shot." Victoria laughed. "You looked so concerned. And then so confused when you realized I was watching butterflies." "Best confusion of my life," Mitchell said. "Everything good in my life traces back to that moment. You, the children, this whole adventure we've been on together." "We make a good team," Victoria said softly. "The best," Mitchell agreed. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I love you, Victoria Farrow. I loved you when you were an obsessed scientist who couldn't be bothered to brush the grass off her dress. I loved you when you were a new mother terrified you'd lose yourself. I love you now, accomplished and recognized and still just as passionate about butterflies as you were that first day. I'll love you until my last breath." Victoria reached up to cup his face, her eyes shining with emotion. "And I love you, Mitchell Farrow. My partner, my foundation, my greatest supporter. You gave me the freedom to be fully myself, and that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They kissed there in the growing darkness, while their friends and family celebrated inside, while butterflies settled on flowers for the night, while the Montana prairie stretched out endlessly around them. The years continued to unfold, gentler now but no less full. Mitchell and Victoria still took research trips, though shorter ones now, often accompanied by Lily and sometimes by Marcus when his own work allowed. They watched their children build their own lives, Marcus marrying a fellow scientist and Lily eventually finding love with an artist she met in Denver. They became grandparents, delighting in the next generation and passing on their love of nature to grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about the grandmother who traveled the territories, studying butterflies, and the grandfather who supported her every step of the way. Victoria continued publishing into her 60s, her work becoming increasingly focused on conservation, as Western settlement threatened butterfly habitats. She became an advocate for protecting wild spaces, arguing passionately that preserving natural habitats was essential for understanding and protecting the species that depended on them. Mitchell continued ranching on a small scale, but his real joy was in supporting Victoria's conservation work. He helped organize local efforts to protect meadows and wildflower areas, worked with other ranchers to implement practices that supported butterfly populations. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. After dinner, Mitchell and Victoria slipped away from the party, riding out to the meadow by Stony Creek, where Mitchell had brought Victoria on one of their first expeditions together. The meadow looked much as it had 3 decades ago, wildflowers blooming and butterflies dancing in the warm summer air. They dismounted and walked hand in hand through the familiar space, watching monarchs prepare for their migration south. "You remember the first time we came here?" Victoria asked. "I remember everything about our early days," Mitchell said. "I remember being fascinated by how you worked, how you saw the world. I remember falling in love with you more with each passing day." "I was so scared," Victoria admitted. "So convinced that loving you would mean giving up my work, my dreams. And instead, loving you made everything possible," Victoria said. "You showed me I didn't have to choose. That was your gift to me, Mitchell. Choice. Freedom. The knowledge that I could have it all if I was brave enough to reach for it." Mitchell pulled her close, and they stood together in the meadow while butterflies swirled around them, living jewels dancing on the breeze. These creatures still migrated thousands of miles, still followed patterns scientists like Victoria were still working to fully understand. They were fragile and yet incredibly strong, temporary and yet eternal in their species' continuation. Rather like love itself, Mitchell thought. Fragile and strong, temporary and eternal all at once. "I want to preserve this moment forever," Victoria whispered, echoing words she'd spoken decades ago. "We already have," Mitchell said. "In our children, in your research, in the life we've built together. We've preserved it in the best way possible. We've lived it fully." They stayed in the meadow until sunset, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary together. A partnership of equals, a love that expanded rather than constrained, a life that proved you didn't have to choose between passion and security, between work and family, between independence and togetherness. As they rode back to the ranch where their family waited, Victoria looked at her husband of 30 years and smiled. Mitchell Farrow, the collector cowboy who'd wanted to preserve a moment forever. He'd done more than that. He'd helped create a lifetime of moments worth preserving, each one a testament to what was possible when 2 people supported each other's wildest dreams. The butterflies would continue their migration, following paths laid down by countless generations before them. And the Farrow family would continue too, building on the foundation Victoria and Mitchell had established, proving with each generation that love and work, family and independence, tradition and innovation didn't have to be opposing forces. They could be complementary, could be woven together into something beautiful and strong and enduring. In the years that followed, as Mitchell and Victoria grew older together, they never lost their sense of wonder or their commitment to each other. When Victoria's hands grew too shaky to sketch, Lily would come visit and illustrate her mother's observations. When Mitchell could no longer ride as easily, he would sit on the porch and watch Victoria work in the meadow near the house, documenting the butterflies that still returned each year. They died within months of each other, both in their 80s, both surrounded by family and love. Victoria went first, passing peacefully in her sleep after a day spent watching the monarchs begin their fall migration. Mitchell followed that winter, his last words a whisper of her name. Their children found Victoria's journals, decades worth of careful documentation, and donated them to the Natural History Society, where they became part of the permanent collection. Future scientists would study Victoria's work, would build on her findings, would benefit from her decades of dedicated observation. But perhaps more importantly, they'd left behind a different kind of legacy. Marcus would tell his own grandchildren about parents who'd loved each other completely while still maintaining their individual identities. Lily would paint butterflies until her own final days, each illustration a tribute to the mother who'd shown her that women could be both artists and scientists, mothers and professionals, wives and independent individuals. The ranch in Benton, Montana, became a nature preserve, protected in perpetuity thanks to arrangements Victoria and Mitchell had made in their final years. The meadow where Mitchell first brought Victoria remained untouched, wildflowers blooming each spring, butterflies returning each summer, a living monument to a love that had honored both partnership and independence. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings, locals swore they could see two figures in that meadow, watching butterflies together, preserving moments that would last forever, not through capture or constraint, but through love that set each other free.